Hello and welcome to the NorthStar Café. I'm your host and founder and principal of NorthStar Solutions and Services, which is a boutique future of work oriented virtual coaching, training, and consulting practice. And we specialize in working with mid career leaders, technology leaders, women in tech, and those who, like me, speak English as an additional language. And we help them figure out their own authentic leadership stance in a way that's most natural and comfortable to them. And I've been hosting these conversations at the NorthStar Cafe for a while now. And every single episode is not only a joy for me personally, but also the engagement from folks like you who watch us live and then watch the recording makes it so much rewarding. So thank you so much for joining us live. And if you are watching us live right now, please know that you can watch us live on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. And wherever you are, hop in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from. And what are you looking forward to hearing today? So the NorthStar Cafe is really, I envisioned it as a space for conversations that are action-oriented and conversations around leadership development, particularly at the intersection of people, process, and technology. And over the past few episodes, we've talked about different aspects and dimensions of leadership, such as emotional literacy as a leadership skill. We talked about what does community-supported leadership development look like. And today, we're going to talk about a concept that I personally had to read up on, and the topic is trauma-informed leadership. And I'm so pleased to bring in our guest for today, the fantastic Rosie Yeung. Welcome, Rosie. Thank you for joining us today. Oh, can you hear us? It froze for a second.
Okay, I'm back. I'm here. Hi, sorry. Talk about being traumatized. Hi, I'm here.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us, Rosie. Rosie is based physically located in Toronto, Canada. And we met via LinkedIn a little while ago, a few weeks ago, on a conversation that meant a lot to both of us, and it was around pay equity, particularly for us as women, as professional speakers. And then we met through that, and then we met over virtual coffee, and then we realized, oh, there's a lot more common ground here. And here we are to talk about trauma-informed leadership. Rosie, before I invite you to share a little bit more about yourself and your background, I do want to let everyone know that one of the similarities I discovered is the sort of a portfolio career, if you will, that Rosie's had, and I could relate to that and resonated with that a lot. And I know you have your career in accounting and on the management consultancy side of things, and then you've pivoted based on your own lived experience, personally and professionally. And I think that there's so much value for us as audience and also folks that are faced with similar circumstances in our own professional and personal lives. So having said that, I would love for you to share a little bit more about yourself and how you came to be where you are.
Thank you, Meenakshi, and just thank you again for having me here. It's a real joy and an honor to be here to be sharing in ways that I never, ever imagined I would, which is kind of what you alluded to about pivoting and changing careers. So yes, you're right. Just a little bit more background, I guess, and I'll pivot that also into an introduction about me, a short introduction. So yes, my name is Rosie. I am currently president and founder of my own company, Changing Lenses. And most importantly, I am a mind-body wellness coach, trauma educated, and always having an equity lens as I do everything. And what that all means, I'll get into, and hopefully you'll gather from our presentation today. But yes, part of why I'm even here and what my mission in life now is to personally heal and help others heal from the trauma of working in a capitalist, corporate, patriarchal, colonized, business world. And that also applies to not-for-profits because it's the same system. So I came from 20 years of doing that, and just to be upfront and to remind ourselves that we're all on a journey, I upheld those systems. I am a professional chartered accountant, professional HR leader. I was a corporate executive and did all the right things, right? The model minority of, even though I'm an immigrant to North America, born in Hong Kong, another British colony, went to the right schools, went and got the degrees, did the, following up the chain, climbing the corporate ladder, trying to find stable income, make my parents proud, all that sort of stuff. And part of why I wanted to come and talk about trauma-informed leadership is realizing how that's not what I was doing for 20 years. Yeah. And that trauma takes many, many forms. We'll get into what trauma is and how that is the case. But after I got laid off at the beginning of 2020, that was actually what I didn't realize at the time was the beginning of my healing journey, because slowly I could begin to unwind and unlearn and relearn new and healthier ways of being and doing and working. And we're seeing some of that now in the not trends, but the patterns of workplace burnout, all the things that are going on, and employees are starting to demand better for themselves. It's because of all that stuff. So that's sort of a high level of a bit of who I am and what I do. Because I also have an equity lens, and I call myself a non-violent JEDI warrior. JEDI because it's Star Wars, and who doesn't love Star Wars, but also because it's my acronym for Justice, Equity, Decolonization, and Inclusion. So just in the spirit of JEDI warriorship, I do want to acknowledge as well that I am a settler immigrant. Yes, I came from a British colony, but I myself am a settler colonizer here on what was formerly known as Turtle Island. And so I'm coming to you today from what we know as Toronto, Canada, which is actually traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And we currently live under Treaty 13 with these nations, not always fairly and justly, and definitely not always equitably. So it's important for me to remember that. And I say this as much for myself as to respect and honor and reconcile with the Indigenous peoples that live here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Rosie. You're not only sharing your background, but also talking about the ways in which you have come to acknowledge how colonization sort of perpetuates, right? And
yes.
And there's so much of that resonated with me, because I just realized that I think I hadn't put all the pieces together for myself, right? So I'm originally from India, and we were a British colony for more than 200 years, and access to the English language, and sometimes at the cost of our own languages and heritage. And then now where I live, it's also settled land. I live in Virginia in the US, and Virginia was the first part of the continent that the settlers landed at. And so a lot of that resonated with me, and thank you for sharing that. And I see some folks here in the chat. Laura, welcome, and thank you for joining us. And we'd love to hear from you, what your thoughts are and what your questions are, and that goes for everyone else as well. So please share your questions and your thoughts on the topic of trauma-informed leadership. Rosie, before I get in, I do want to share some context. So with my experience in the healthcare space, healthcare care delivery and technology space, I am familiar with trauma-informed care, the concept of being trauma-informed. And particularly in the hospital setting, that is a big deal. And being trauma-informed is a big part of care delivery, right? So the labels we use for people and how we use diagnoses to describe people, instead of like, I am, so-and-so is diabetic. Instead of saying so-and-so lives with diabetes. Diabetes is a condition. It does not make that person something else, right? So I'm very aware of that. So when you and I first chatted, and you shared your background and what you talked about and the concept of trauma-informed leadership. That was and is new to me, and which is why I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. So really, the opening question that I have for you is, what is trauma-informed leadership, and what does it look like in the workplace?
Yeah, you're giving me all the feels, and actually, this is also why I love doing this with you. I am first putting into the chat a resource because I want. I've been doing. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a therapist. I am a trauma-informed coach and a positive intelligence coach. So just wanting to recognize that, and that nothing I'm doing is giving medical advice. What I am on a mission to do is to share what I've been learning because it has been so impactful and healing for me. And I recognize how it's very like the trauma itself in our corporate workplaces is hidden, unacknowledged. I wouldn't say invisible, but we don't know where to look. We don't even know to look, right? So I think a starting point, and where I get a lot of information is from Dr. Gabor Mate, who is himself a trauma survivor and he's a medical doctor and an expert in these areas. And so I've been learning a lot from him and his colleagues. So I just wanted to thank you for highlighting that. Just want to put that out there for people to reference. It's a book, and he does many podcasts and YouTube broadcasts for free. So I think a great starting place when we want to understand what is trauma-informed leadership is to understand what trauma itself is. And I think the reason why it is so hidden or unacknowledged is because we have a very limited understanding of trauma. I definitely had a limited understanding of trauma. And when we think about, for example, mental health and how we speak about mental health in a corporate setting in particular, look how far we've come and what we thought about mental health and neurodiversity before. So it's not surprising that we don't think about trauma in the workplace or that's necessarily applicable because probably like me, you may think that trauma is some disaster happening, like the earthquakes that just happened in Turkey and Syria, or the war that is in Ukraine. And certainly those are trauma-inducing events, right? And I guess maybe one caveat too I want to mention as I describe what trauma is that they can be absolutely these devastating events, and they can be very personal events like a murder in the family or being sexually assaulted. And I in no way mean to diminish or say that that's not real trauma. It absolutely is. And that's what we typically think of as trauma. I think where we can broaden our understanding, and certainly as leaders would be helpful to broaden our understanding, is to also understand that as these trauma medical experts have shown through research and through a lot of study, is that trauma, first of all, is not what happens to you, but what happens inside you. That's what Dr. Mate says all the time. It's not what happens to you, but what happens inside you. And if you compare to, say, a physical injury, right, because that's how we typically understand trauma. We've seen probably in medical shows on TV where if somebody's physically injured, let's say their arm is broken in an accident, then they say they go into shock, right? That's a common term. Their trauma is the broken arm. But the trauma itself is the injury. So it's the fact that the arm itself is broken. If it happened from a car accident, the car accident might trigger the trauma. It might be a traumatizing event, but the trauma itself is not the car accident. The trauma is what happened to the person's arm, right? So in a similar way, the earthquake itself is not the trauma. It's what happens in reaction and response emotionally, spiritually, psychically inside the person as a result of that. And then to understand, again, deepen our understanding what trauma is, it is not necessarily just bad things that happen. Again, in no way diminishing the severe impact of terrible and negative events that are happening, but it's also good things that should have happened to you, but didn't. And there's so much to this topic that there's so much I want to say, but I will try and keep it very, very basic. So understand there's a lot of depth to this. But a kind of a simple way to understand it is thinking about human needs and a baby, right? So newborn baby, so sweet. They know nothing about hiding their authentic selves, right? They are just, if they have a need, they will tell you by screaming and crying or kicking or spitting up or any of those things. And so what a baby needs is very representative of what we all need as human beings, right? We all need attachment, which meaning we need love and care and to know that we are accepted for who we are. And we also need authenticity, which is a loaded word we can get into, but it's to be ourselves, to know that when I am hungry, I'm going to cry until I get food, right? So the nurturing and meeting the basic human needs, which are not just physical, but also deeply emotional and about care, we deserve those things. We require those things as human beings. And to not receive them, to be deprived of our basic emotional needs as well as basic physical needs is also, or can be also, traumatizing. How much it might be traumatizing to the individual depends on a whole host of things, including that how nurtured they come to the table already and a whole bunch of stuff. But hence why trauma is not just something terrible that happens, and therefore we think of this group of traumatized people. Rather, it's more appropriate to think of a spectrum of everybody in some point in their lives, because you've never had all of your human needs meet, right? Let's just acknowledge that.
Yeah.
At some point in your lives, you've all experienced some kind of trauma. And so where do we fall on the degrees, the spectrum of trauma versus who are traumatized people and who are not traumatized people? So I think we haven't really gotten to the leadership part yet, but I just wanted to lay that foundation of a deeper understanding of what trauma is and how people might get traumatized. And I'm sure there might be some questions from that too, so I'll pause there first.
Yeah. And I think that was so valuable, right? What you said, trauma is not what happens to you, but what happens inside of you as an outcome or as a consequence, not even an outcome, as a consequence of what happened to you. And I think that's such a valuable insight to understanding what trauma is and isn't. And also, you're so right. I mean, trauma usually has to be something catastrophic in our general sense of the word. We think about something very catastrophic, something that took away something that means a lot to us, and it's usually more often than not, we tend to think of it in very tangible terms, right? It's associated with loss generally of maybe life or wealth or sometimes even loss of dignity in everything that's happened, right? But in the workplace and how you I'm sorry, I'm just seeing a comment here.
Yeah.
The notion that trauma is what happens inside a person in response to external events is super helpful. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I also wanted to call out, before I forget, I loved your acronym expansion of JEDI and the fact that D stands for decolonization. And I think that is such an important conversation to have. I often talk about decolonizing my own heart and mind because of how, for example, the English language has taken over my personal life so much so that that's become my first language, right? And now how I feel about it and what it has done to me, I'm not sure if I'm going to call it trauma, even with this new understanding of trauma, but it is something that is a part of my lived experience at work. And so it is something that I work through on a daily basis, right? So I just want to call that out. It struck me, and I missed mentioning that. So extending this definition or new understanding of trauma that you've shared with us, how does this work out in the context of in the context of leadership?
Yes. So, and this is where I think people, I'll be totally upfront. I think people might struggle to link it so directly to the workplace, let alone being leaders at work, because it's still so ingrained in us, right? That maybe colonization, even though it was hundreds of years ago, quote unquote, would be because they still see physical impacts. And there is now a greater recognition of violence and rape and horrible things that happened. But again, just keeping in mind that depending on the individual, the degree to which it affects somebody, just like the degree to which your ancestral colonization and how you've internalized it today, Meenakshi, that depends person to person. So the same event could happen to the same event could happen to two different people, and one person might be traumatized, the other person might not be, right? So hence I will preface this by saying it's nuanced. So stick with me as I try to unpeel the layers, right, around how this happens at work. But I want to go back to those two basic human needs of attachment and authenticity. And I know authenticity is become almost stigmatized itself because it's
Yes.
like a DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion buzzword. And I think it's also stigmatized in how people might be labeling individuals and say, oh, well, that's such a millennial thing. Like we tend to think of this need for being my authentic self. People who have less of an understanding of that need, probably from their own trauma, will, kind of not see it as valid, right? Or as a real need, and certainly not applicable at work. But I want to reinforce again things that medical doctors like Dr. Gabor Mate have indicated, which is that authenticity, first of all, it's not a new age yoga mindset, mental wellness preference. It's not optional. It is part of our basic need for human survival. And again, that goes to like literally physical survival, where authenticity at its root is about being true to our gut instinct, being able to rely and trust our gut instinct, because that's what, like, evolutionarily led us to survive, right? If we are, caveman ancestors, were faced with a saber-toothed tiger and they didn't trust their gut instinct to, oh, this is dangerous, run away, then they would not have survived very long.
Yeah.
Right? They also needed to be
Absolutely.
in community, right? They also needed to have other people in their tribe to help fight the tiger or just to feel safe with.
Yeah.
The trouble is, especially when we get into a work context, the trouble is that very often those needs clash, they conflict, right? Because what people want us to be in order to accept us doesn't, or almost never does, fully align with our authentic selves in terms of our sense of humor, how we might choose to work, our working styles, how we speak, and especially if we speak different languages, not the English language business language. So we will sacrifice, because attachment is actually, especially when we're children, attachment is the greater need. We'll die first from a lack of attachment than we will from a lack of authenticity. So over time, imagine over a lifetime of sacrificing authenticity, and depending on what types of identities you hold and the situation that you come from, certain people groups and certain individuals will have to sacrifice their authenticity more than others. And that itself, that disconnection from ourself, from our gut feelings, is traumatizing. And depending on the individual, depending on their circumstances, the degree of the trauma will vary. So as leaders, when they talk about, here's another buzzword-ish, gaslighting, that imagine you're told that a circle is not a circle, it's a square. And there's other psychological studies that actually show that conformity means that even if like you're seeing it's clearly a circle, but if 9 other people are telling you it's a square, you're going to end up calling it a square. Just like you think you're crazy, right? That instinct of, I know it's a circle. How can it must be me. If 9 other people are telling me it's a square, it must be me. Over time, not just one incident at work, not just one time somebody saying a circle is a square, but other times people saying red is green, blue is yellow. We're not racist, right? We're not sexist, or you can't wear that. You have to dress a certain way. That's not professional. Your hair's too black. All these things that are disconnecting from ourselves, that are telling you you're not good enough. And in order to be good enough, in order to be liked and accepted by your tribe of colleagues and your bosses at work, which is also a survival matter. It's not just then about the connection with others, which is critical and important, but literally your income, your livelihood depends on this.
Yep.
If you continually have to sacrifice who you are and what you think to be true, that creates disconnection from other people and disconnection from yourself, and is traumatizing. The degree to which it is traumatizing is what varies. So as leaders, that's how we get into, what do we do then as leaders, right? So DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or what I call JEDI, is not a nice to have. It's not just a way to be better business leaders. It's not just a way to be more productive and make more money. Those things I believe are true, and they come as a result. But the imperative for it, it's not just for the people you're leading, it's for yourself too as a leader. You're disconnected because to get to where you were, you also had to hide or suppress authentic parts of yourself. That is just the nature, the systemic nature of our corporate workplaces.
Wow, so much wisdom to unpack there. What really stood out for me is what you shared about how attachment supersedes everything else as the primary need, right? And I was thinking back to my own experiences right from my childhood all the way till now, where there were so many things that I've done just to fit in because I was always the proverbial outsider because I grew up in places where I didn't speak the local language, or my mother tongue is different from the local language. And so that's a point, a point of otherness, if you will. My name, people can find out from my last name where I'm from and things like that. And so I've always had to I shared this the other day with a friend. I said I always have had to explain myself, the reason for my being there, right? And so that's nowadays when I think back, it's exhausting to do that, right? And I have to. Most conversations here in North America will begin with teaching people how to pronounce my name. And so it's while I appreciate people that are actually interested and that are actually sensitive enough to ask me to help them pronounce my name correctly, it is still, if I have to invest a part of my conversation just for that, right? And then I have to think back to times, okay, there are places in the world where I wouldn't have to do that.
Right? And even me, like, I remember the first time we met, I guessed how to pronounce your name, but I still asked you to confirm for me.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And so, like, conversely, I mean, actually, here's a question for you. How does it feel because now the majority of the time, the first time you meet somebody, you have to teach them how to say your name. What does it feel like for you when you're somewhere and the first time somebody meets you, they don't ask you how, and they just know? Like, what is that? What's your response?
It feels like home, right?
Yes.
And which is kind of ironic because when I lived in India, which is where I'm from, my country of birth and where I was raised, I did go through these same experiences because I was from a different part of the country, and we speak different languages in different states, and so I grew up in a different state other than where my ancestry was from. I lived in a different state. So many, many years. So, chunks of my life, like 10 years over there, 10 years over here, and they were all, there's something to do with this 10-year mark. So I will say this, if here I meet someone and they just say my name, they don't ask me to help them pronounce it or validate that they have the right pronunciation, I find myself saying thank you to them. And also that, hey, you got it. So then it must not be that difficult to pronounce my name. You know what I mean? So there are all these different sort of unrelated but related emotions, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think this is a wonderful example, actually, Meenakshi. So I'm so glad you brought this up because it's another one of those ways that it's the subtlety of it, right? It's like, say your name is John Smith. So for all of you watching and listening, just imagine it's not so much that it takes so much time, but imagine if you've never had to explain your name to anybody. So John Smith, everybody in English speaking world can probably say John Smith. But now imagine if you were living in a place where nobody knew how to pronounce John Smith. And every time you met somebody, you had to prepare yourself. I picture him actually almost as bracing of, okay, I don't know if this person's going to know how to pronounce my name or not, so I have to be prepared. It takes energy. Like you described it as exhausting, especially over time, and that's completely true. It's hard to. I think this is also where we can be more inclusive in how we think about things, where it's not even the big things so much. Racism and systemic inequity today isn't as overt as what we think of as the obvious ways that we would never do racism. But it still takes energy. It still takes energy from the people who are not in the majority, who have to prepare themselves to explain every time. And I think that's almost a relief, right? It's like, wow, that's energy given back to you.
Oh,
That's
relief
one
is the
less
word. That's
burden,
right. When somebody
right?
says it right, I'm like,
Right?
okay, we can now
Yeah.
actually have the conversation.
Yes. And it's like just one less burden you have to bear.
Yeah.
It's an extra, think of it like the knapsack almost,
Yep.
right? Like it's just an extra knapsack you have to carry or a backpack you have to carry to know that your name is something you have to explain to people. So to not have that weight, that that lifting, oh god, I feel my shoulders lifting up even as you say that. And
Yeah.
that's just one small, I don't want to undervalue it, and I don't want to overstate it, but it's just one small example among, I'm sure, many things that you carry every day, that it's like, okay, this is an extra burden that not everyone has to carry.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for saying that. And also the question that you asked me, right? How does it feel when you don't have to? And that was a great point of reflection. And something else I wanted to highlight a little bit in what you shared, the other basic human need of authenticity. And I totally agree with you that the word authenticity is, to me, it's been overused. It's become a bit of a cliche, and I think it's still grossly misunderstood. One of the ways in which I've seen authenticity being practiced is people thinking that they can do whatever they want and they can say whatever they want because they're being authentic to their true selves, right? And I take objection to that, because I think that authenticity does not come at the cost of responsibility, right? So to me, being responsible for how you come across and how the impact that you create, it's not just your actions, it's not just your intent. Your intent and impact need to be aligned.
Yes.
And so to me, authenticity really comes from that, where um, it's not oversharing, and it's not saying that I'm not responsible for the impact I create for you, or how I leave you feeling at the end of this interaction. And I know it can go either way, but to me, I think that's an element that I always want to I always try to bring in when I say, okay, I'm my authentic self. What does that really mean? I think that to me, that um, particularly as a leader, I've seen leaders that just overshare, and for them, that's the badge of authenticity and vulnerability that they wear, which I think is not always a great way to be with teams and with people that you lead. Anyway, so that was just an observation that I wanted to share. But everything that you've shared so far and leading up to, you actually started alluding to the next question that I had, was what are your thoughts on JEDI and the way you define it, and trauma-informed leadership? How are those two connected?
Yeah, and I'm gonna sort of address your question with also picking up on what you just shared too about what about the impact on individuals, and what are people's responsibilities for what they say, especially if they're saying, but I'm being authentic to myself, that's what you told me to do, right? Which I agree, it's this, there's so many, I think okay, here's where I'll start. I have so many things to say, I'm stumbling over my words. Where I think I would start is that none of us are taught to be authentic, right? We're actually conditioned, maybe that's a better word. We're conditioned almost from birth to learn not to be authentic because we're trying so hard to be accepted, right?
Yep.
So it begins as a child. I forget about forgetting about race and gender for the moment. From childhood, we start getting told what's appropriate to do, what's not appropriate to do, how to sit at the table, when not to sit at the table, how to cross your legs, not cross your legs, all these things that end up us as very impressionable human brains, especially at that young age. We're like, okay, what is it that my caregiver wants from me? And how do I need to adapt? And if the way I need to adapt is not natural to my authentic self, as in if that's not naturally how I would behave or what my personality is like, then I end up creating coping mechanisms so that I can get that approval and love that I crave and need as well, right? And we learn those things, and over time, they become our masks, but we think it's ourselves. And then almost worse, it becomes labels that people put on us, right? So it'd be like, oh, Meenakshi, that's just how Meenakshi is, right? She's just this kind of person or that kind of person. She's quiet, she's loud, she's aggressive, she's passive, right? These things get put on us as if that's who we really are. which is another way that we lose our authenticity. So how I think about it and how I've been learning about it from, our medical trauma experts is it's not permission to do and say whatever you want without consequence. That is not responsible, and that is not accountable. At the same time, it's not acknowledging what you have control and accountability over, which is actually where your authenticity and your empowerment comes from, which is that, and this is a very difficult concept that I had to wrap my head around a lot. And it comes up around JEDI issues because it gets to like cancel culture and being triggered and, what's racist, what's not racist. So bear with me again on this one. Your feelings are your responsibility. Nobody makes you feel anything. Nobody can make me feel anything. And the first time I learned this in all my studies, it was really hard for me to accept, let alone grasp, because when we talk about our feelings, it's usually either you made me feel, especially in the context of racism or sexism, right? You made me feel a certain way. And that goes on both sides. Or when people ask how you feel, like I asked you, actually, how do you feel when somebody asks you how to pronounce your name or doesn't? We often will say like, well, I felt not seen, or I felt disrespected. Like that's how we talk about feelings. But that's actually not what feelings are. Feelings would be, I feel angry, I feel hurt, I feel happy, I feel love, I feel bored, right? These are actual human feelings. So that's what I mean when I say we're not taught what authenticity is or how to be authentic. And so it can, now that we're in this, I guess, an unlearning or relearning stage of our society, it's almost like we're all young children flailing. Like, what does authenticity mean? I'm going to try this. I'm going to try that. Maybe it means I can say whatever I want. Now, the fact that, and this is where I caution, because the fact that you don't make other people feel anything seems to reinforce, right, that lack of responsibility. It's like, well, then I can say whatever I want, because if Min actually feels hurt, it's not my fault because she controls her feelings. Yes, Rosie controls her feelings, Meenakshi controls her feelings, but that doesn't make it okay to say racist things, right? We're responsible for our behaviors. We're not responsible for how the other person receives it, simply because, as I said earlier, like I can be racist and one person may be really traumatized, another person may not be so traumatized. But that doesn't mean I didn't say something racist. That's a quality of like how much care did they get, what kind of support, how quickly do they recover, sort of their resilience, right? I'm just as racist. The consequences for me should be just as severe, regardless of whether that person is deeply traumatized or not. And in like on the other side, when people say, well, you're just cancel culture, or I feel attacked as a white person, for example, I feel attacked as a man, and now I'm scared to say anything, and you did that to me. No, that's not the case. Somebody arguing against racism or standing up for anti-racism, your reaction as a, like, I'm not racist, or your defensive reaction, it's very normal. It's very human. But that does not mean that you're being attacked. That actually has to do with your own, how do you see yourself, right? And your own, I would say, inner conflict of, am I not being accepted? Like, am I doing something wrong? And I thought I was a good person. I thought my authentic self was a good, not racist person. How do I reconcile these things, right? So I also kind of want to put that out there as a compassionate, like self-compassion is where it starts. When we start talking about what does trauma-informed leadership look like, it starts with self-compassion, because that's where our deepest compassion for others comes from. I know from my own heavy self-judgment, self-criticism, self-shame, that I do that to others because I judge myself first, the harshest, but then I also put that onto other people where, well, why aren't you performing perfectly, right? Why aren't you as aware of racial issues as I am? Like, this is how it should be. This is how it should be, right? And that really comes from, if I am scared about being a racist person or whatever discriminatory impact that might have, if I was fully comfortable that I'm not, no matter what, I can be a good person and say and do racist things. That's true for everybody. But it doesn't take away my self-worth. It doesn't take away who I am as a person full of love, and a person who really cares about justice and wants to do good things. And I think we just don't have, because we're not given that as a society, especially in a Western colonized capitalist society. We're not given that security of knowing that no matter what we do, that doesn't affect who we are. We're not what we do, we are who we are. And so the more that we heal, the more that we can recover and recognize the ways that we've not been nurtured, the ways that we've been traumatized from childhood onwards. That's where we start building the self-empathy, self-compassion, and opens up our minds and our hearts to hear each other differently, where we're not feeling attacked, we're not afraid of being attacked, and we're not triggering each other's traumas, so that we can actually listen to what each other is saying.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the call out on self-compassion, and that being the starting point for what we show towards others, I could not agree with you more. And I think that's such a valuable insight as well. The other thing, one of the questions you said about about how we judge others, and you said, why are you, I'm paraphrasing, why are you not as concerned about issues around racism as much as I am? And what came up for me is like, wow, I have judged that about others. And because these topics are in my field of vision, and so they're important to me. I chose to bring them into my field of vision. Right? And so, and there are plenty of people that are part of my network or circle or whatever I want to call it. And I don't have the same conversations with everyone. And that's not, I don't think that's anybody's fault, right? Something has to happen. My life experiences have brought me to this point where these topics I choose to bring into my field of vision. And that's the realization I just had as you asked that question. So I want to thank you for that.
It's for everyone, right? We're all on a learning journey. And I have to remind myself, I was not this educated on trauma or racism or equity or colonization a year ago or 3 years ago, right?
Yeah.
So we're all in the same boat. There's all stuff passion for.
Absolutely. So I want to extend that some of the last thoughts that you shared in terms of with my next question is, what does a trauma-informed leader look like? So for someone that's listening or that will watch the replay later, and if they're thinking about it, what kind of environment am I in, and am I surrounded by trauma-informed leadership? What are some markers that they can look for?
Yeah, you're right. It does start kind of picking up from where I last left off about the self-empathy, and self-compassion. And I think that actually, I'm going to be bold and say something, because self-care is starting to be another one of those buzzwords that's falling into the same eye roll bucket as authenticity and DI and stuff, which I think is a real shame, because that actually to me indicates our lack of self-compassion, right? Just that we're so used to the normal society of rushing around, produce as much as possible. This is just how life is. We're so used to living this that we can't imagine a way where you're not constantly behind, you're not constantly stressed out trying to rush from work to home to picking up the kids to getting the groceries and what are you going to eat tonight, and I said to a group of friends actually the other day, I don't remember a time where I wasn't always worried about being late and feeling stressed about how I was going to get everything done. That has become normal. So it is not indulgent. It's not a luxury to say that I need some time to work on myself. That to not just for your people's sake, but for your sake as a leader. And trust me, I'm saying this to myself as much as to anybody else. I do what I say, not what I do, please. It is about slowing down. It's doing whatever it is that you need to do. Maybe it isn't slowing down, but whatever it is, to be able to say, wow, this isn't good for me. This isn't good for me. So how do I start from a place where recognizing for yourself, what is it that is your trigger? Trigger is another one of those buzzwords, right? It keeps like, well, you triggered me, or I'm being triggered. Let's think about for a second what that means. And Dr. Mate has a beautiful analogy for that. Well, a powerful analogy for this. When you think about a weapon, and here in Canada, it's less common to see guns, but when I see guns on TV, what is a trigger on a gun or any weapon, right? The trigger is the smallest part, in a way, of what the gun itself is. So if I pull a trigger, it causes incredible harm, but the harm doesn't come from the little tiny trigger piece. It comes from the ammunition, from the firing of the gun. And so if we as individuals, whatever's triggering you, somebody else might be pulling the trigger, but the harm that's caused in you isn't actually from the trigger itself or even from the person. It's from the ammunition. And the ammunition, this unexploded nuclear bomb, is the burden, right? Like and actually what we talked about, the burden of constantly having to explain to people your name. That may not be the specific ammunition itself, but it's all the things that we haven't healed from, all the things that have caused us to be injured in the past. And unhealed trauma is like a festering wound. When you think about it, like imagine you cut your arm and you never got it treated properly. What happens to that? At best, you get scar tissue that covers it, but the scar tissue is painful, it's ugly, your arm doesn't function fully in the same way, right? Because it's not the same as the original skin, it was never properly treated. And so that's really what happens when we're getting triggered. It's all the stuff may have nothing to do with race, it may have nothing to do with gender or any other equity issues. It could be something, okay, here's an example, a personal example. I remember one of my early memories of childhood was pooping my pants. And that was not voluntary. I was in kindergarten and like a dutiful child, because I'm very obedient, right? That's one of my coping mechanisms. I raised my hand because I knew I needed to go to the bathroom. But I think the teacher was annoyed already because some other kids were I don't know what it was. But she was getting tired of people raising their hands, I think. And so by the time I raised my hands, it was like, do you have a question? This is what the teacher said. Do you have a question about this book? If you're not, then I don't want to hear it. We said something along the lines of, as my little 5-year-old self, I was like, I'm going to just shut up now. And I won't say that I need to go to the bathroom. And I pooped my pants. Now I can tell you this story now and laugh about it because I have been healing from this. But the fact that I even remember this happening shows how traumatic it was. Now this isn't exactly the result that happened for me, or maybe it is, I don't really know. But I'm going to extrapolate this to, what if now, as a leader at work, you have people around you or a person around you who's the wallflower, right? Never speaks up. And on the performance reviews, you're always writing, this person doesn't take enough initiative. This person never, speaks up in meetings, never offers ideas, right? We always have to drag it out of them or blah, blah, blah. What if that person never really learned to raise their hand, or as a coping mechanism because they pooped their pants as a kid when the teacher told them to shut up? What if they have struggled ever since to be that first one to initiate, to be aggressive, whatever aggressive means in our Western, to be assertive and to enforce their opinion out there? But they're not going to tell you that. And none of us know, right? So I'm not saying that as leaders, we're responsible for asking what happened to them as 5-year-old children. But as a starting point, I think it's knowing all the stuff that we have that we've never told anybody, right? That we probably don't even realize ourselves are still impacting us. Is just to pause and be open to the idea that there's more behind that than just what we see on the surface. In some cases, much, much more. And to give space, to give compassion for, why can't they meet my expectations? They know the job description says this, this, and this. Well, what are some things that not just technically or professionally might be preventing them from doing it, but how much more space or benefit of the doubt can we give to say that they're not just slacking on the job, they're not intentionally trying to ruin your day or not meet a deadline or whatever it is, but that there's other stuff that prevents us from doing even what we know to be good, right? Like think about how many times it's good to get more sleep or to eat healthy. Why don't you do it? If it was that easy, you would have done it already, right? So it's all that stuff that none of us have worked out. And hence, the first step isn't to try to change other people, because A, you can't, and B, you shouldn't. But to change yourself, to heal yourself, right, in the best way, and to be supportive of other people to start to do that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that and for sharing your own story. And when you said the fact that you remember it from so long ago, I think it that the experience that you had that associated with that incident is still, it's still there, and that's why you have the recall that you do, right? Um, thank you for sharing that. And I see a question here. So my responses are not going through on LinkedIn for some reason. So we invite you to share your question here via chat. So yeah, since this is a live stream, I mean, you can add your questions to the LinkedIn post, but you're free to add your questions here in the chat, and we'll take it up from here.
Yes, and I just typed that in the chat as well. So if it wasn't clear, we'd love to engage. So feel free to comment or ask questions as we go.
And while we wait for the question to come through, as we begin to wrap up this conversation, Rosie, first of all, I want to acknowledge that this was not even like the tip of the iceberg. There is so much to talk about. This should probably be a conversation series.
For
and
sure.
that's something I'm thinking about. So more to come on that. But as we begin to wrap up, let's say the first installment of this conversation, what's the one thing you would like people watching live and also watching the replay? What's the one thing, if nothing else, you would like them like for them to take away from our conversation?
Yes, thank you for leading us to this space. I keep putting my hand on my heart, actually, because that's one of the ways I'm learning to. One of my healing practices is just getting back in touch with my body. So I didn't even realize, but I tend to put my hand over my heart as a sign of gratitude and also just like centering almost. So yeah, the one thing I hope people can walk away with is that I've talked a lot about the harms, right? And the history. And I did that intentionally because there's such a lack of knowledge and awareness of it, even in the medical community. Dr. Mate says this all the time. He never learned this stuff in medical school. So not surprising, nor should we be blaming ourselves at all if that's happening, what we don't know. What I haven't talked about as much, but I really hope you receive through the screen is that there's hope, there's absolutely hope, and there's healing. Right? Like the starting point is awareness, because we can't heal what we haven't diagnosed. As we learn more about this, there is absolutely light at the end of the tunnel. And I think a lot of the things that we don't even attribute to what could be traumatic, or if that's too tough of a word for you, just what is not healthy for us, is that there are healthier ways of living and being. It's just that's not going to come from corporate world. It's not going to come from, the annual goals and the performance reviews and quarterly financial review settings and stuff like that. It's not going to come naturally. We're going to have to take initiative for that for ourselves. And we can also take initiative and advocate for that for others. So it's that trigger and that unexploded ammunition that I refer to, like the stuff that really hurts you inside, that is also harmful because you never know when it's going to come up, right? Like if we're not aware of this unexploded bomb that's within us, the trigger could happen at any moment. As we work on ourselves, as like through coaching practices, right? Like full disclosure, that's what I do. That's why I got into this, is because I recognize the need for myself and for others. So as we start working on healing practices, as we uncover what those unhealed traumas are that end up being coping mechanisms that sabotage us, right? They started as ways to protect us, but as we grow into adulthood, they actually limit us, right? And even sabotage the good things that we want to do. Working on those body-centered practices, that unexploded bomb gets smaller and smaller. And we're able to both anticipate triggers that might come up, as well as have better defense mechanisms, better ways of diffusing this bomb. The bomb doesn't have to completely go away. I don't think that's even possible, right? But it can have a much smaller impact, and we can recover from it faster, right? Resilience is kind of a word that encapsulates that. So again, just wanting to offer in empathy and compassion that leaders, anybody, and that includes you as a leader, it's okay. It's not only okay, it's necessary for you to receive this healing for yourself, right? To work on this, to diffuse your own bombs, to make your ammunition a bit smaller. And that actually is the starting point that enables you to offer that to others. And that becomes or grows into your leadership practice, right? There's lots of talk about being empathetic leaders or leadership empathy. And to me, this is just one aspect of that.
That's exactly what I was thinking too. So thank you so much for sharing that, and how beautifully said, Rosie. Thank you very much. Once again, thank you to everyone who are watching us live and those who will watch the recording. Today at the NorthStar Café, we talked to Rosie Yeung about the concept and practices of trauma-informed leadership, and we agreed that this is just the beginning of many such conversations. So we hope that you feel inspired to carry forth these conversations in your own environments and then come back to us for any questions and thoughts that this conversation may have triggered for you. So once again, thank you so much for your time. And we'll be back at the NorthStar Cafe on March 8th, which is International Women's Day. And it's a special episode where I'll be meeting with the mentees and mentors of a mentorship program that I launched 2 years ago called Building My Runway. And it's a global virtual mentorship program for women in tech, mid-career women in tech. And we'll be speaking with mentors and mentees from the cohort of class of 2022. So that's the next episode, and I look forward to welcoming you all again there. And Rosie, oh my goodness, what a pleasure. Thank you so much for doing this with me, and look forward to staying connected and sharing more such conversations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for being here today.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone. Be well.
Bye.